Tenzin Priyadarshi is the founding director of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He received his undergraduate degree and was also an integral honors scholar studying philosophy and physics, and has a graduate degree in comparative philosophy of religion from Harvard University. At the age of 10, he entered a Buddhist monastery in Rajgir, near ancient Nalanda University, and was subsequently ordained by his spiritual mentor, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Venerable Tenzin lectures internationally and is also the president of the Prajnapaya Foundation, a global humanitarian organization. He also lectures at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and various other institutes of learning. So may I now request you to give us a teaching on the 8 verses for mind training?
Right. Maybe I'll use the printed version so you're on the same page. Begin with a brief invocation that is customary. Om Hariro Dhamma Padam Anachedama Shashwadam Anekarthamana Northamanagmam Nirgamam Yaha Pradita Samutpadam Prapancho Pashmang Shivam Deshyama Sambhustang Mande Bhadata Varnam Buddhang Gacchami Sharanam Yavada Bodhi Mandata Dharmam Gacchami Sharanam Bodhi Satpurana Dada Sarvasadisha Samadan Prarthayami Kritanjalihi Dhampradipam Kurvantu Mohadatu Prabhadanam Akashas Daryavadi Avasa Jagadas Dehe Tavnam Siddharbuya Jagat Dukhani Ningadaha Manjugoshang Namasyami Yat Prasadan Mati Shubhe Kalyana Mitrang Vande Ham Yat Prasadach Vardate Namastare Ture Vira Tuttare Bhayanashini Ture Sarva Ture Kale Swaham Karang Namamyaham Ye Dharma Hetu Prabha Hetum Te Shantadavdate Te Shanchinarode Vangmadi Mahashima. The pleasure and delight to be able to spend some time together. You guys can hear me okay? My voice is not as up. Or you can just become more cozy. It's just my voice is not as robust today. I was with like 60,000 people in Ladakh, and I think there were things floating in the air. So, no way. Sorry about it. Okay. I have enough partially deaf people in my community in the US, so I don't want to encourage that community. I think the other way around. As long as you guys in the back can hear, okay? Yeah. I don't need to speak into this, right? You can hear me, okay? Okay, good. So, well, it's a delight to be here, and we'll try to do justice to this brief text. Brief texts are my favorite. There are plenty of lengthy text in the tradition. But more specifically, this text, because it comes from the Kadam tradition. Kadam masters are one of my favorite group of teachers, because they were kind of no-nonsense kind of teachers, very straightforward, very pithy in their instructions. And more importantly, they exemplified the teachings by the life they lived. There was very little gap in learning and practice when you look at the lineage or the history of the Kadam masters. And historically, the Kadampa tradition in Tibet thrived at a time of sheer confusion. It was a little bit akin to confusion that is there today, but today's confusion is a bit more chaotic, which was historically in that era in Tibet, there were Buddhist sources that were coming from different places geographically, not only from India via Kashmir, but it was also coming from south of China and other places. And there came a time when people began to sort of wonder what is authentic dharma, or what is the lineage of various traditions and teachers who were passing through. And so in that time of confusion, to have somebody like Atisha, who was directly connected to Vikramshila and Nalanda, to be physically there. And more importantly, his sort of lineage with teachers like Drumtompa and others sort of added to a sense of clarity. And of course, further clarity sort of, came about with various other events that occurred in Tibet. Most prominent of it was the debate at Samye between Kamalashila and this Chinese monk who was simply given the name Mahayana. Not a very good historical note-taking. And then, depending on which side of the debate you read, either Kamalashila won the debate or the other guy won the debate. But we got a very good text out of it called Stages of Meditation, where Bhavnakram, where Kamalashila sort of methodically sets into motion what the practice of meditation as taught by the historical Buddha is. But going back to Atisha, as some of you may be aware that he was one of the few individuals who not only studied in India, but went as far as Indonesian islands, the present-day Indonesia. And one of his teachers, and Atisha is credited to have studied with over 150 teachers, which is quite a remarkable thing to have 150 gurus to study with. But of all of them, an individual by the name of Serlingpa, who was based in the islands of Serling in the modern-day Java Islands, that Atisha studied this particular genre of thought transformation, or what came to be known as lojong, and brought it back to India and then took it to Tibet. And Atisha had a very fascinating life and journey when you are a master of that caliber, sometimes it's hard to separate historical accounts from legends of teachers. But he was truly an individual who was made of legends. And just the way he sort of agreed to go to Tibet itself sort of, again, demonstrates his commitment to Buddha Dharma, to Bodhicitta, and so on. When Atisha was invited to Tibet, he was probably in his 60s. And Tibet was a hard place to get to in those days, still is, especially in those days. And especially for a man who's 60 years old. Average lifespan in India those days was probably like 75 or so. And legend is that he asked his tutelary deity, Tara, when he was asked to come to Tibet. And apparently Tara told him that if he goes to Tibet, his life will be shortened and he'll pass away there. And if he stays in India, he would enjoy a slightly longer, healthy life. And so knowing that, he decided he would go to Tibet. And via Nepal, he went there and sort of taught all kinds of individuals based on the request that he was given and so on. But it's truly sort of remarkable, his own life and then life of his sort of primary disciples in Tibet, specifically Dromtongpa, who was a lay teacher, and then, of course, the later Kadam masters. And so this is one of the compositions, a brief one on 8 verses on training the mind, which is, again, belonging to this genre of lojong text. There are various kinds of texts in Buddhist tradition. Some texts that are, devotional. Some texts are epistemological, more philosophical. But there's a whole group of texts that can be seen as practice manuals. And this one is a practice manual. There are some texts that are both devotional, inspirational, and practice manuals, like the Perfection of Wisdom, Pragya Paramita. And but this one is it's purely a practice manual in terms of how to go through this process of thought transformation, or if you like the word, mind training. That's sort of another way of approaching it. With a determination to achieve the highest aim for the benefit of all sentient beings, which surpasses even the wish-fulfilling gem, may I hold them dear at all times. So it sets the context for the text. And here, it also gives you a little bit of sense of the functionality of mind training and the functionality of why one should engage in the process of thought transformation. So the first thing is, it doesn't tell you that it has any conventional utilitarian function as of yet. It's not telling you that by virtue of practicing this text that you'll become a successful human being or noticeable human being or whatnot. Meaning the context that the text is setting is that the determination for enlightenment, to achieve the highest possible aim, and to benefit other sentient beings. That's the premise, that's the context that should encourage or motivate an individual to even embark on such kinds of trainings. Anything else that happens is a byproduct of that training. But one thing that it sets very clearly is the role of sentient beings. That sentient beings, in this particular way of looking at them, that they're not to be seen as burdens. Sometimes when we recite "may all sentient beings," or "for the purpose of all sentient beings," it kind of feels like a heavy weight is there on your shoulder. Like somehow you have to carry countless sentient beings on your shoulder to enlightenment and so on. Then the other part of it is the reality of dealing with sentient beings. Humans are not the most pleasant of all creatures. So it's very hard to sort of look at sentient creatures, specifically human beings, as pleasant beings. Some people have much easier time relating to the pleasantriness of pets, of dogs and cats and turtles and so on, rather than human beings. Meaning they find it much more difficult to relate to humans. But here, when the context has changed in the sense that sentient beings to be held dear at all times. And why so? Because from a Mahayana perspective, as Chandakirti, he mentions in one of his writings, that sentient beings are the cause of enlightenment. Instead of paying homage to the Buddhas or to a deity, like most traditional texts do, he pays homage to sentient beings. That if you're seeking Buddhahood, sentient beings are the cause of that Buddhahood, and therefore sentient beings should be cherished. And so it changes your perspective on how you look at sentient beings. They may still not be pleasant, they still may not be likable. However, they are to be cherished. So it shifts again, this idea that from the very beginning, you begin with the mindset that no matter what, the ups and downs of personal interaction with certain sentient beings might be. But the framework is that sentient beings are to be cherished. Why? Because they are, in some ways, the primary cause of enlightenment. If it wasn't for them, then the whole sort of Mahayana enterprise of enlightenment wouldn't exist in that particular manner, that may I attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. So in some ways, without sentient beings, there is no bodhicitta. Without bodhicitta, there is no samyak sambodhi or anantara samyak sambodhi. So the very beginning of the training tells you that shift your mindset and begin to look at sentient beings as a category of things, a category of beings that should be cherished. Not necessarily liked, not always adored, not always hated, not always disliked, but cherished. Cherishing something is a very different feeling of things. There are things that you may not like, but you could still cherish. And there are things that you cherish, that you like, and it's easier sort of to think in your mind that because I like this thing, I can cherish it. But at that moment even, we are not able to necessarily understand the profound nature of what cherishment is. For example, your breath. You may or may not like to breathe, but you know it's necessary for your survival, and so you cherish it. Meaning that it's not a function of whether I like or dislike my breath, but I do cherish it. So you shift that mindset towards how you view sentient beings. They are like breath. They are the life force of bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is the life force of enlightenment, and hence sentient beings ought to be cherished. So may I hold them dear at all times, and that's the mindset of a practitioner to begin with. Whenever I interact with someone, may I view myself as the lowest amongst all, and from the very depths of my heart, respectfully hold others as superior. Again, remember, it's a training manual. It's not the pleasant of verses, and it's not the easiest of verses. So to put it into practice is a bit of a challenge. It's a bit of a challenge, especially because the social norms, your ego tells you otherwise. So it's not that the verses on training the mind are always going to be palatable. There are certain verses that might be more palatable than others. Now, this thing of interacting with someone that may I view myself as the lowest amongst all, and from the very depths of my heart, respectfully hold others as superior. There's a quality that is encouraged in spiritual life and spiritual practitioners of humility. So we have come across the term humility in different cases, oftentimes as an antidote to arrogance. So, if you encounter somebody who thinks that he or she knows everything, you encourage them to have intellectual humility by suggesting that, no, there may be domains of knowledge that you don't know much about, and there's something to learn. So you keep your arrogance in check. The idea in spiritual practice here is that oftentimes than not, we enter into two stages of mind when we are interacting with others. Rarely our interaction is sort of a level-headed interaction. It's either that of arrogance, that I'm superior to this other person, I know more than this other person, I possess more than this other person, or that I have some degree of superiority than this other person. Or the other extreme is the inferiority aspects, where this person knows way more than me, possesses more than me, but not in a manner that you admire those qualities. You fear those qualities. You even become envious or jealous of those things. That, at the best, inspires a false sense of humility. Religious world is filled with false sense of humility, where people demonstrate physically or otherwise that they are humble, that there's a degree of humility to whatever they're doing. Genuine humility is hard to come by, because genuine humility actually comes from a place of strength and clarity. It doesn't come from a place of inferiority, and it doesn't come from a place of arrogance. Genuine humility comes from a place of strength and clarity. The strength to recognize that what my limitations are. Not to suggest that those limitations will be permanent limitations. I can work on those limitations. But the sheer recognition that these are my limitations is useful. And clarity, which is how I'm going to engage in this particular form of interaction. And so as a practice, one undertakes this particular kind of attitude of humility, meaning that you don't shout out loud during your interaction that, oh, you are everything, I'm lower than you. And that generally, again, is an expression of false sense of humility. But genuine humility that comes in where you're able to recognize that there is something about this other person that might be more profound than you, and so on. So at least in the best case scenario, you treat the other as equal. In the best case scenario, you treat the other as equal, but you don't get into the sense of superiority complex, or you don't get into this notion of inferiority, and so on. The second aspect of such mindset is a different kind of recognition, and I may have mentioned it in some prior teachings. There's a very favorite episode in the Sadharma Pundrik Sutra, the Lotus Sutra. Favorite as in favorite to me. And there is this bodhisattva, I think the Sanskrit name was Sadaparirudita, or in Japanese, Fukyo Bosatsu. And he only has one practice, and he reminds me of Kadam Geshes, the practice of Kadam Geshes. He only had one practice. Every morning, he wouldn't be seen in meditation halls or reciting texts and so on. From morning to night, he will be in front of the main gate of the monastery. And everything that passed by him, he would just put his palms together and bow to it and say, I bow to you because you will become a Buddha one day. And that was the only practice of this particular individual who became a bodhisattva. And the beauty of that practice is that it didn't matter what passed through, what category of sentient being passed through. The simple recognition that you have Buddha nature, and I bow to that Buddha nature, and that one day you will become Buddha one day. So the second aspect of humility is that particular recognition. Buddha Dharma is based on the premise that all sentient beings are born to become Buddha, meaning that they all possess Buddha nature. So if we truly genuinely believe that all sentient beings possess Buddha nature, you have to presume the idea that they are going to become Buddhas one day. And if they are going to become Buddhas one day, how is it that I should interact with them? Meaning, if you have Buddha nature, how should I interact with you? I should interact with you as if you're a candidate for Buddha. It could take you this lifetime, or it could take you a million lifetimes. Nonetheless, the potential is there. So this sense of humility also allows us to increase on the probability of recognizing Buddha nature and other sentient beings. And not just in a manner of theory, not just in a manner that, oh, Buddha said, all sentient beings are born to become Buddha, so such is the case. But this genuine act of recognition, of trying to recognize this. The more you recognize the capacity of Buddha nature in others, the better chances are that you will see Buddha nature in yourself. That's just how human mind works at times. But you see that already the framing of your interactions has shifted. The framing of your interaction from these sentient beings that I dislike, perhaps even hate, these sentient beings who are ignorant and stupid most of the time, oftentimes annoying, barely can tolerate them. To have that kind of perspective, to shifting the perspective that they too will become Buddha one day. And that changes the way you're looking at sentient beings. And it offers sort of a great degree of clarity and resolve in how you're interacting with sentient beings. One of my many favorite images of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of my favorite images is, and it was captured beautifully by one of the photographers in the office, was when His Holiness was visiting some small town, I think. It's hard to say what's a small town these days. I think it might have been Bhopal or someplace like that. And he was hosted in a government guest house, someplace like that. And there's this photo of the Mali of the property, the gardener of the property, greeting His Holiness. And His Holiness is bowing to him as if he's bowing to the statue of Buddha. You can see that in his face. And you can see the Mali, there are certain expressions that's hard to sort of translate into English. This expression, gud. This Mali is smiling from one ear to another ear. You see? He's not arrogant that the Dalai Lama is bowing to him. He's just in a state, in an overjoyed state. And it's captured so well. The Dalai Lama greeting the Mali, and the Mali greeting the Dalai Lama. Two human beings. Those photos, that expression did not come from the governor of the state or head of the state and things like that. Just the Mali and the Dalai Lama. And you recognize that, of course, the Dalai Lama has this wonderful quality of meeting people as they are, to see their true nature and so on. And that's one of the most beautiful non-discriminative mindset, of his own cultivation and practice of bodhicitta. But you encounter that even in your day-to-day life, which is that if you're able to see past the role that the individual plays or what the individual is, meaning to be able to connect heart to heart, that you will truly bring forth the sense of joyful encounter, the joyful engagement with this person. And there are many such stories with His Holiness. But this idea that from the depths of my very heart, respectfully hold others as superior, that this is a part of training that you go through, meaning that you don't announce it out loud. You go through it, but you can enact it from time to time in your day-to-day engagements, and you will begin to see how things do shift, how your perspective of what sentient being is, what human beings are, or even what the reality of this world is, will shift just by practicing this particular verse on cultivation of humility and so on. In all my deeds, may I probe into my mind, and as soon as mental and emotional afflictions arise, as they endanger myself and others, may I strongly confront them and avert them. This is one of the signature gifts of the mind training tradition, of the lojong tradition, that in all my deeds, may I probe into my mind, and the importance of examination, investigating the mind. But at the same time, the sheer presence of a sense of vigilance in one's mind, vigilance. That no matter what kind of thought comes in, that I'm observant of it. I observe whether the thought is beneficial or harmful, meaning I weigh the thought in that particular manner. And I look at my mind at all times, meaning observing my mind at all times, for any kind of afflictive behavior or afflictive thought that might arise. Because the understanding that even a single afflictive thought could be detrimental to my well-being or to the well-being of those around me. A legend says that it took Atisha quite a bit of time to reach Tibet. First, he had to be convinced to get on a horse. As a monk, he didn't want to get on a horse. And when he got on the horse, very frequently he will get off the horse, get on the one knee, and make a confession. And the idea was that Atisha was so vigilant, even at that stage. Remember, he's a faculty at Vikramshila. He's a pandita, effectively. But even at that stage in his life, if even a slight negative thought entered his mind, he would actually recognize it, bow down on one knee, and observe that thought, that this occurred, that he won't let it slide. It really annoyed the Tibetans who were taking him to Tibet because it really slowed down the process. But he was very faithful to this particular kind of discipline, which is the importance of being vigilant. Another legend says that Atisha did have an attendant that he brought to Tibet. And the king of Tibet asked Atisha, because he saw the attendant who was visibly very annoying individual. So he asked Atisha, he said, in all of India, could you not find anybody else to accompany on your travels? And Atisha's response was, he helps me work on my patience. Meaning that even at that stage in his life, he has, of course, the sense of humor, but he acknowledges that there are certain things that he's working on, meaning that he's not all perfect of a teacher. This idea of vigilance is of tremendous importance. No matter what practice you do, and sometimes, certain practices are more revealing than others. Sometimes certain practices become mechanical because you do it over and over again, but there is no life force in the practice itself. Certain practices, at best, are masquerade. They just hide what actually is going in your mind. When you're vigilant, when you're observant, you become finely attuned with your mind. Now, remember that when we speak of bodhicitta, or the cultivation of bodhicitta, it's not occasional good thoughts. occasional kind thoughts that come to your mind. It is a complete transformation of your psyche. It's a complete transformation of your chitta, of your consciousness, from an ordinary mind to that of bodhi. It's okay in preliminary stages to tell ourselves that we should have 3 thoughts of kindness, 5 thoughts of compassion, then maybe manifest one of those into an act of kindness, and so on. Meaning that in the beginning, it's okay to say that to be compassionate, to be kind is just occasional acts. That in this flow of things that we do, oftentimes mindless things, that there are some conscious things that we do, and maybe they are compassionate things, they're kind things. But bodhicitta is not occasional acts of kindness or compassion. It is a complete transformation of your mind stream, such that whatever arises from that mind is of the nature of compassion, meaning that you don't have to make the effort to make a distinction by saying, is this kind? Will this going to be beneficial? The idea is that if the mind is transformed, and it is of the nature of bodhicitta, then all that arises from that mind would be beneficial for others, for oneself, and so on. And therefore, it all begins with this observation, this vigilance, that in this precious territory of my mind, in this precious real state of my mind, that I'm going to try to truly observe what arises. And I'm going to try not to let too many afflictive thoughts take roots. They will arise, they'll disappear, but to take roots, to become firm in your mind stream is another thing. And so when you're vigilant, that act of vigilance in itself does magical work. When you're vigilant, then your mind in itself will tell you these thoughts belong here, these thoughts do not belong here. These emotions belong here, these emotions do not belong here. But it all begins with the sense of vigilance. It doesn't begin with just a kind of passive observation. One of the things that is detrimental, again, to Bodhisattva's path is this popular expression in English, I'm just a human. Not a very useful expression. When do you use that expression the most? I'm just a human being. You use that expression the most to voice your failures, to voice your inadequacies, to voice that you're not perfect. When you do good work, when you're kind, when you're compassionate, people praise you for that. Do you ever respond and say, no, I'm just a human being? People say, no, you did such a wonderful, generous work. Do you ever just say, no, I'm just a human being? This is what humans are supposed to do. You say, when did it enter into our psyche that being human means to be inadequate, to be imperfect, and so on? It's important to change that narrative for ourselves. The Bodhisattva's way of life, implying that these imperfections too are not something that should be passively accepted in a manner of saying, I'm a human being, I'm imperfect, and it's okay for such destructive emotions, toxic emotional state to exist. They're there, I observe it, but should they truly occupy the prime real state of my mind or not is up to me. That's a choice. So you have to think again through that Buddhas are human beings, Bodhisattvas are human beings. You don't have to constantly, enter into a mode of self-flagellation about your imperfections, but you can be vigilant. Meaning, in Buddhism, guilt is not a useful virtue, shame is. Shame is what allows us for observation and self-correction. Guilt is dwelling in shame. Dwelling in shame is a sheer waste of time. But shame as an observation to say, this occurred, this happened, should not have happened. That simply gives you a pause and a motive to self-correct. Remember that we human beings are only as good as our ability to self-correct. Much of lojong is about self-correction, meaning that it is not about passively accepting the fact that this is what should define human beings, including imperfections, and that's what I am. Lojong is an invitation to truly engage fully in this mode of self-correction. Self-correction to the point of enlightenment, meaning you're self-correcting ignorance, you're self-correcting certain behavioral shortcomings. But that is what we are best designed to do. So when it says, may I strongly confront them and avert them, meaning it starts with vigilance. And then it begins with the process of examination, meaning are these toxic emotional states welcomed? Are these toxic emotional states, do they have a place in my mind? Why do they exist? So, more importantly, are they desirable or not? And this is, again, one of these things that sometimes we get into this, discursive mindset, and we try to give credence to certain toxic emotional states. Credence meaning that we validate it. We validate, for example, anger at times. Anger is such a powerful emotion, such a powerful rush. It can transform things, it can change things. And sometimes when your anger allows you to break free from a certain things and it ends up having a positive outcome, you validate that anger and you say, this anger is good. These days, everybody's outraged about one thing or the other. The question a practitioner asked is it a desirable state to be in? Meaning, when I wake up in the morning, is anger the first desirable state? Even during the day, is anger the next desirable state? So, thinking of afflictive versus virtuous emotional states, not just in the sense that tradition says that these are virtuous emotional states, or tradition says that these are toxic emotional states, but to reflect on it and say, are these truly desirable states or not? Do I envision myself spending next 8 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours in an angry state? And do I wish that upon myself or not? So the first thing is that if you're trying to work on afflictions, on mental afflictions, you have to clearly establish the boundary that they're afflictions. If you're wishy-washy about your understanding of what these afflictive states are, then chances are that they will take root in your mind. They'll take firm grasp in your mind stream. And those are the things that a practitioner ought to be sort of more cautious about by virtue of being vigilant. The important aspect here about confronting and averting is that sometimes we get very good at observation only. And we become very self-congratulatory about that observation. I am aware that I am a very envious person, or I am aware that I'm a very angry person. I'm aware of my shortcomings. And we become very self-congratulatory about that shortcoming. I'm aware of it. And you know what? I'm better than most people around here. Why? Because I'm aware of it. And we relish that awareness of our shortcoming for next 15, 20, 30, 40 years of our lives. Meaning, what we haven't done is confronted it or averted it. So again, remember that vigilance and observation is just stage one. Next is applying antidotes, how to transform it, how to recognize whether it justifies being in this mind stream of yours or not. So that again requires a bit of effort on part of the practitioner. So it's not just the passive awareness that I have destructive emotions or destructive thinking and so on. And it may not even be a full-blown destructive thing. That's why the term that we often use is toxic, that you may not recognize its destructive nature, but you will begin to recognize how it slowly releases toxicity in your mind stream in one form or the other. When I see beings of unpleasant character, oppressed by strong negativity and suffering, may I hold them dear, for they are rare to find, as I have discovered a jeweled treasure. Again, not a straightforward verse that you can readily put into practice. But it simply reminds us, again, that not all sentient beings are of pleasant character. We'll meet a lot of unpleasant sentient creatures. In fact, you'll meet a lot of unpleasant character even within your circle of relatives and friends and so on. If strange people are unpleasant, you brush them off. But when your relatives, people you care about, people who are close to you, when they are unpleasant, now you run into this difficulty, right? You cherish them, but they're unpleasant. But it's not the worst one cherishment. This is more of a grasping kind of cherishment. Meaning that I tolerate their unpleasantness. Why? Because I'm attached to them, or they're attached to me in one form or the other. So I don't tolerate their unpleasantness because I cherish them. I tolerate their unpleasantness because of the sense of grasping that I have for them. And in fact, the sense of grasping is such that I increase my capacity to tolerate their unpleasantness. And probably they do the same for me. And it doesn't help either of us because we just are unpleasant to each other for a very long period of time. To recognize that even within such relationships, that these are individuals who can actually teach us a thing or two about our own cultivations. And this is where the Kadam masters were very straightforward and very good. For example, they did not favor people going into caves to meditate on compassion forever. You go in, you meditate on compassion, you come back, and you live among some of these unpleasant characters. And they will be the litmus test of whether your meditation actually worked or not. If I'm sitting in a cave, which has its own importance, but if I'm sitting in a cave in this pleasant solitude with no annoying characters around me, then I think I'm the all-compassionate, patient individual that there is. Why? Because I don't have to exercise this. I can just believe that that's who I am. Meaning the real test, whether the cultivation has actually happened or not, is when you are around such individuals. And that's why the Kadam masters refer to these particular kinds of sentient beings as your teachers. That these particular kinds of sentient beings, this category of unpleasant sentient beings, unpleasant characters, who test your virtues, who test your cultivations, who test your practice, that they are the ones that you should be especially grateful for. Seldom you can pay and find such test subjects for yourself, who are there constantly prodding you, constantly sort of making you reflect on your practices and so on and so forth. So hence this idea that may I hold them dear, for they are rare to find, as if I have discovered a jewel treasure. Now, it does two things. One is that it tells you that in order to truly evaluate your practice, in order to truly evaluate your accomplishments, whether you have reached a threshold of patience, a threshold of kindness, a threshold of compassion, in whatever way, that you need such special characters to validate and say, yes, you have done it. The second part of it is also that this gives you an opportunity again to change your perspective about such characters. Now, in this expression, I'm saying that it tells you, it gives you an opportunity to change your perspective about such characters. It also gives an opportunity for them to change their perspective about you. Meaning that they recognize that just because you label yourself as a spiritual being, you label yourself as a Buddhist or a practitioner and so on, also means that you're willing to engage with them. It also means that you're willing to cultivate some of these kinds of qualities. Otherwise, what happens oftentimes in early years of being spiritual is we become like porcupines. Porcupines? Everything is a threat. Everything feels like a threat to my spiritual development. I'm meditating, somebody asks me for some help, that's a distraction, a needle goes up. I have a worldview that I practice, somebody challenges that worldview, another needle goes up. So here we are, supposed to be the image of Bodhisattva Samantabhadra, embracing all of creation, all sentient creatures. But what we become is spiritual porcupines. This ego guarded by a set of needles. And we sit there thinking, I am the only sane one. That I am the only one who's qualified, and it's too bad that I don't make sense to anybody else. So it's important, again, to go back to the first thing, which is that the cause of enlightenment is bodhicitta, the cause of bodhicitta is sentient beings. You cannot have needles towards sentient beings. You need to cherish them. And in order to cherish them, you have to gain a certain kind of understanding into not only your own psyche, your own mind, but also the mind of other sentient beings. When others, out of jealousy, treat me wrongly with abuse, slander, and scorn, may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to others the victory. For those of you who think Buddhism is a practical set of teachings, try this one. There's nothing practical about this teaching. When others, out of jealousy, treat me wrongly with abuse, slander, and scorn, may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to others the victory. Certain practices, you begin with quiet mental visualizations. This is one of them, again. Meaning, you don't go out announcing that it's okay to be abused. Buddhism is not in favor of martyrdom. There are certain traditions where if you become a martyr, you automatically sort of gain certain notoriety of sorts. Here, the first thing is, as a practitioner, to understand that this urge to defend myself, this urge to counter what other people are saying, this urge to counter an insult with another insult, this urge to react to one angry expression with another angry expression. Where does this really come from? Where does it really come from? This verse is a moment of that pause where you ask yourself that when others treat me wrongly when they abuse me, they slander me, they scorn me, they're jealous of me, and I want to get defensive about it, or I want to respond to it in a certain manner. Where is that response coming from? Is that response coming from the same fragile ego that gets offended every 5 minutes, that feels insecurity most of the time, that truly doesn't understand or is able to distinguish between, say, a sense of care and a sense of flattery, that does not make a proper distinction between a sense of healthy criticism versus a sense of insult? See, meaning that in this ego, in this confused state, we conflate all of these things. So here, the first thing is that it suggests that offer the benefit of doubt to others in this mental exercise, that when somebody insults you, abuses you, and so on, you offer the benefit of doubt to others in the sense that why does this person have this kind of attitude towards me? Now, at the end of the analysis, you may tell yourself that this person was a complete jerk. But you have to go through that analysis of asking yourself why I am responding in this particular manner. The second thing is to recognize, which is that should I be responding to every voice of insult that comes towards me? Meaning, the world is a big place. You're not going to make everybody happy. By definition, samsara is loaded with envy and jealousy. If you are simply surrounded by people who are complimenting you, something is wrong with that picture, right? So what is rare about this idea that somebody is envious of you, that somebody is jealous of you? So this verse, again, in terms of the thought transformation, it allows you to go deeper into your own sense of self, your own sense of ego, and say, why is this ego reacting to so many things? And offering victory to others here, implying that one, you don't need to engage with every voice of slander, every act of slander that comes your way. The second thing is that when it says, may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to others the victory, there are two ways of looking at it. One is that you have analyzed your ego, you have analyzed where the response is coming from, whether it's true or not. And secondly, whether it's going to be helpful to respond in this particular way or not.